Well, good morning. Good to have you all here. And of course, we're in our series about the era of Judges. We're calling it Sticks, Stones, and Jawbones. And we'll explain that more and more as we get throughout the series. But if you recall from last Sunday, we talked about this kind of cycle that goes on in the book of Judges. And this occurs over a lot of years. The book of Judges takes place over somewhere between 300 and 350 years, a long time, longer than our country's even been in existence. And through it, there's this kind of cycle. Remember this cycle? The people, they trust God. They're in this faith relationship. Then they turn to idols. They want to take a shortcut on the whole faith thing. They fall away from God. God brings in usually some sort of foreign invader, suppresses them. They turn to God. God brings them a judge, and they kind of come back up. And you can track their history kind of like that. And in the same way, it follows kind of their spiritual trajectory, right? And if you follow through all of those cycles, it's not just a cycle where they kind of go up and then they go down and they go up and then they go down. It's more like this. If you track them through those hundreds of years, it's kind of like they go up and they come down and they go up and they come down and they go up and they kind of like some of our 401ks these days. You know what I'm saying? It kind of has that pattern to it. And by the time you get to the end of Judges, there's this kind of denigration that has been occurring over these hundreds of years, and it's really starting to get ugly. In fact, about three quarters of the way through the era of the Judges, in the text, there's this phrase that pops up. And if you would, turn with me to Judges chapter 17. Judges chapter 17. I want us to look at this phrase here. And it's going to pop up and it will start reoccurring. And actually, the very last verse in the book of Judges mirrors this exactly. But here it is in chapter 17. Chapter 17, verse 6. It says this: "In those days, Israel had no king." And kind of the inference here, obviously, is that this is an era where there's no kings. This is book of Judges was probably written in the time of David, somewhere around there. It says, in those days, Israel had no king. And the other inference with this is the idea they're leaderless. They're leaderless. But they've done this to themselves. It is their falling away from faith is the reason they don't have a leader. They're kind of wandering, meandering, spiritually and physically. And then it says this, and here's part of the reason: everyone did as he saw fit. They've kind of gotten to this moral place where they're not even hardly a society anymore. Everyone just kind of does whatever he or she wants to do. And so jealousy and selfishness and revenge begin to reign. And the era of the Judges really closes out with two stories that are a total contrast to each other. And the first story is found near the end of the book of Judges, and I'm not going to read it, I'm just going to tell you about it. The tribe of Benjamin, some guys in that tribe do some horrible things. They won't bring the perpetrators to justice. Some of the other tribes demand justice. They won't. It turns into this intertribal mass homicide revenge. It's just awful. All of these tribes come together. They attack the tribe of Benjamin. They wipe out pretty much all of the women, all of the children, and most of the men. And there's this awful scene when everyone realized the fighting is kind of stopped, and they all realize the tribe of Benjamin is going to be over because they have no women, no children, and the tribes have sworn that they'll give none of their daughters in marriage to the men that are left for the tribe of Benjamin. When these men die out, the tribe's over. But, it's okay because they work it out by kidnapping women from other countries and from other tribes. That's their answer. And it's this, you're just like, this is awful. In some ways, it's reminiscent of what we saw so many years ago in Rwanda. Mass murder within a society of people. They destroy themselves almost. And you have this picture of what it is to be without any leadership and everyone simply doing whatever he or she wants to do. But there's a contrasting story, and that's where we're going to spend our time this morning, that is absolutely phenomenal. And it's not a story we normally think of with the book of Judges, but it's a story that is a part of that era. And at one time, in ancient times in the scrolls, the story of Ruth was actually a part of the book of Judges. And for different reasons throughout history, it's kind of been in and out. And in our Bibles, the way it was canonized, Ruth has been separated out as its own book. But it is a story that very much belongs in the story of Judges and in that era. So flip with me over to Ruth chapter 1. Ruth chapter 1. And here's what you have to know. Here's one of the major themes or lessons that comes out of Ruth. Because Ruth takes place near the end of the era of Judges when all of this mayhem is going crazy. Ruth is this shining example that even though everything is just kind of trailed off to the unthinkable, here's the truth that we get out of Ruth. God is still at work, always at work, and secretly at work. God is always at work, still at work, always at work, and secretly at work. That is a theme that we're going to see throughout this book. In fact, I want us to say this together. So I want you to say this with me. It's up on the screen here. Ready? God is still at work, always at work, and secretly at work. That's what we're going to see despite all that has occurred. So look with me, Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, it says this. In the days when the judges ruled, and this is the era near the end of this era, there was a famine in the land. And a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Remember, how do you think the Jews thought of Moab? Remember last week's story? Remember Eglon? And they didn't think too highly of Moab. They didn't like them too much. They had been suppressed by them multiple times throughout this tenure of Judges. And now he's got to turn and go and live in Moab. It goes on, fills in a few more details here. Look at verse 2. It says, the man's name was Elimelech, his wife named Naomi. In Hebrew, Naomi literally means sweet or sweetness or pleasantness. And everything about this story is to let us know that Naomi is this sweet, beautiful woman. And not just a beautiful on the outside, but she, as we say in the Barteau household, she was pretty to the middle, okay? We want beauty to go real deep, pretty to the middle, okay? That's what the author's trying to tell us here, sweet Naomi. And the names of her 2 sons were Molon and Kilon. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So you got to picture this. Here's Naomi and Elimelech, and things are going great, and then suddenly things don't go so great, right? He loses his job, the economy tanks, and of course it is, because there's all of this horrible infighting. The Philistines have really taken a deep hold in the area of Judah by this time, and so it's tough. You know, he loses his job or maybe some land that he was farming, and now he's got to take something else, and they're scratching by on things. You know, it's macaroni and cheese for dinner or top ramen soup for dinner. You know, date night is going to Costco and just sampling things. You know, if you take your date out, you just keep going in a big circle around Costco until you're full, and, you know, it's a cheap date. So, you know, they're doing the Costco date night. They're doing their best to make it work, but at some point this doesn't work anymore. They realize we can't keep our house, or we're going to lose the vehicles. There's no more work here. And so there's this moment where they say we've got to consolidate. We've got to take everything we've got, and we're going to a foreign land. We're going to go someplace we did not want to go. You know, we're going to have to get work in Phoenix, I guess, or something like this. Some Phoenix lovers in the audience, I'm sorry. And so they go. But you know what? They're young. They've got their 2 kids. It's them against the world. And so off they go to Moab. They start to make a life there. But they get to Moab and things don't go so well there either. Elimelech gets sick or injured. We don't know which. And you can just picture Naomi as suddenly his life is hanging in the balance. And she begins to pray, God, you know, you got to heal him. You've got to help him, because this is all we've got. And they pray. Can you imagine them praying as Elimelech, his life is in the balance. And they pray and they pray. But it is to no avail. And Elimelech dies. And now Naomi is a single mom in a foreign land trying to make the best of the situation. And you know what? This is sweet Naomi, pretty to the middle. She bucks up, faces up on this thing, and she raises those boys, does the best she can. They grow up, they're able to get jobs, they get married. And it seems like things are starting to pull together again. But something happens again. And her boys get sick. And they pray. God, we made it through the loss of a dad and a husband, but we don't know if we can take this. You've got to intervene. You've got to act. God, where are you? We need you now more than ever. But her first son dies, and then her second son dies. And now the story starts to take this strange twist as even though hard times come, you keep thinking, somewhere in here it's going to turn around, it's going to turn around, and it doesn't. It doesn't. In fact, the text tells us that Naomi has reached this spot of total desperation. She's talking with her two daughters-in-law, and she says, you know what? It's hopeless. I'm too old to get remarried. And this becomes a huge issue because normally a widow in this time, their retirement, the way they would survive would be one of two ways. Either they would get remarried so that they would have a husband and their husband's family that could support them in their old age, or if their husband had died, they would have children and they would go and live with one of their children and their children would take care of them in their old age. And she says, I don't have either. I've lost my husband. I've lost both of my boys. No one can support me now. And I'm in a foreign land. And here's the truth. She's now destined to become a beggar. There's no hope for her in this. Can you imagine the moments as she processes this? God, why would you let this happen? How could this happen to me? Imagine the memories she has. Those moments where she's thinking about life with her husband and how they started off and the life they dreamed to have together that is not. You can imagine her thinking about her boys. The first time one of them climbed a tree or learned how to walk, the first tooth that they lost. And you can just, or the time that they put, eggs in a tube sock like a slingshot and threw it at the neighbor's house. Just hypothetically speaking, just, throwing that out there. Not that I know anything about that, but just, memories like that, the boys getting in trouble and now all of that is gone. And it's interesting what the text says. At one point, look with me down at verse 20, chapter 1, verse 20. There's an interesting thing that she says here that the author puts in there, wants us to understand how deep all of this is. It says this. She says, don't call me Naomi, sweet Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara. Anyone know what Mara means? Bitterness, or very bitter. And she explains why. Look what she says. Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. All is lost. And the author wants us to know she's reached that point in life where she has no place to turn, doesn't know what she's going to do. And this beautiful, pretty to the middle woman is suffering in ways that we all just say, this can't be, this is not right. But the theme of this book, the message underlining it all is God is still at work, always at work, and at work in secret ways. He is secretly at work. And so there are three lessons that we're going to see that we can apply to our own lives when we're in those moments where we face loss or we face difficulty. We face that moment where we feel like, man, somehow I've been caught in the whirlwind of a culture or a world or a family or a community or whatever that's somehow falling apart, like what happened in the era of the judges. So three lessons that I want us to look at here this morning. The first lesson is this. When all seems lost, we don't have to give up. We don't have to give up, even when all seems lost. And the author wants us to know this because God is still, say it with me, okay, ready? God is still at work, always at work, and secretly at work. That's right. And that's a truth in your life, not just Naomi's life here. And maybe you feel it in your finances the way they did. Maybe it's something you lost your job and you spent a life studying and being trained for a certain career that you loved. And now there's no hope of you having employment in that career for a long, long time. and you find yourself working a job that you hate, that is a dead-end job, but it is the best you can do to make ends meet. Maybe you've lost that job, and you're left swirling. Maybe it's cost you your house. Talked with someone just last night, actually, and she was almost in tears because she's in the middle of repainting their house because it has to go on the market today because they can't keep it. And maybe that's you. Maybe it's your health. Maybe you've gotten news back from the doctor and it's not good. And you've prayed and you've said, God, I don't understand this, and why would you do this? Maybe it's the loss of a loved one. Maybe you know what it is to lose someone close to you the way Naomi has. Yesterday, one of my very long-time friends died. And I watched him die over the last couple of days and got to the hospital just minutes after he died yesterday. He was one of my camp counselors going all the way back to elementary school. I know his kids. And he is such a wonderful part of this church. And now I look and there's a wife and 2 kids and grandkids. And maybe you know exactly who I'm talking about because it was a loss in your life too. Or maybe it was someone else that you have lost. And you have fought and you have prayed and you have trusted and you've got to that place where you just say, I'm out of gas. My marriage is hurting. My family is hurting. I don't know what to do with my family, my finances. And we reach those points in life, friends, where we simply run out of gas, where depression keeps us in bed and anxiety keeps us from sleeping. And if that is you, then you know what sweet Naomi was facing. But this story about Ruth is a promise that God is still at work, always at work, and secretly at work. And there is a reason why you don't have to give up hope. You can keep hoping, even when you're out of gas, even when you hurt, even when you're out of energy, even when depression and anxiety are ruling over you. You can keep hope that God is still at work, because that's what the author wants us to understand about this story. In fact, there's an interesting thing that happens in this story that is a kind of strange, encouraging irony, okay? And here's the irony. There are no miracles in the story of Ruth. And there's other places in the book of Judges where we look and you're just like, man, God intervened in amazing ways. He steps in and does the supernatural. Or God intervenes with clarity of voice, and there's kind of a thus saith the Lord moment. There's none of that in Ruth. There's no moment where the seas split, where people walk on water. There's not even talking donkeys, okay, in the story of Ruth. And you look at all these other stories in the Bible, and there's so many moments where it's so clear that God steps in and does and intervenes in this world in a supernatural way. But there's none of that in the book of Ruth. But here's what the author is wanting us to get, okay? While there's no overt moment of a miracle, here's the truth, here's the irony. The entire story is a miracle. The entire story has God's hand underneath it at every step, at every moment. When Elimelech and Naomi must leave Bethlehem, God is there and God directs them, and God is there when they travel to Moab. God is there when their sons meet these girls. It is no mistake that Ruth is connected to this family. It is going to be no mistake when Ruth and Naomi go back to Bethlehem in this. Throughout the entire story, there is this theme that God is always there in secret ways, always working, never giving up. And so what the author wants us to know, what God wants us to glean from this story, is that no matter where we are, no matter how deep the loss, no matter how bitter you feel right now, there is reason to have hope, because God is still at work in your life. He is always at work in your life, and He is at work in secret ways in your life. So hang on. When you feel like Naomi, you hang on and do not give up. Now, here's the second lesson that we get out of the story of Ruth, and it is this. Sometimes in our greatest pain, we receive God's greatest gift. Sometimes that's the moment when we get God's greatest gift. Now, what happens in the story here is Naomi realizes she's about to become destitute. If she's going to become a beggar, she might as well go back to her hometown of Bethlehem. She hears the economy's picking up a little bit there. So now she's saying goodbye to her 2 daughters-in-law, and she loves them very deeply, and there's lots of tears. It's a very emotional moment, okay? But then suddenly, Ruth does something. Ruth refuses to leave Naomi, and there comes what is really probably the most famous passage in the entire story of Ruth. So look with me at chapter 1, verse 16. Look at verse 16. So Naomi's made this big plea, go back, find your own Moabite husbands, and you all get to start over. You're young enough to start over. Verse 16, but Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. And here's this famous passage we've probably all heard. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. And we get this beautiful moment in this story. The hinge moment in the story is when Ruth becomes this amazing gift of grace from God to Naomi. In Naomi's greatest pain, she receives one of the most amazing gifts, and it is Ruth herself. Remember, all throughout the era of the Judges, God takes these strange items. They seem to be these little powerless items that couldn't change anything, but they do. There's a sharp stick in one story. There's a little bitty fragile story like we looked at last week. There's a millstone. There's a donkey's jawbone. All of these weird things. And when we get to the story of Ruth, there is a small, seemingly weak item that God uses to express his great power and grace. But in the story of Ruth, it's not just an inanimate object. It is a person. And it's Ruth. Who would predict that Ruth would be the savior for Naomi? She's this young girl. She's this young widow. What could she possibly do? And that's how God works. Sometimes in our moments of greatest pain, he uses the most unsuspecting things, and they become these tremendous gifts. And that's Ruth. Ruth, in fact, we'll look at this in a little bit. In some ways, she becomes this beautiful icon of Christ as she literally, it's almost as if she's laying down her life. In fact, just real quickly here, flip over to verse 22. I want you to just see this real quickly. This is very interesting what the author does here. Starting in verse 22, it says this, so Naomi returned to Moab, accompanied by Ruth. Now here's something new that happens in this story and will continue through the rest of this story. It's no longer just Ruth. It might happen 1 or 2 other times, but the vast majority of the times, from now on, when the story refers to Ruth, it is Ruth the Moabitess. And the author is not going to let us forget. She is a Moabitess. She is from Moab. Now, here's why this is important, right? The Moabites were hated and despised by the Israelites. The Moabites were descendants from Lot. The Moabites represented everything that was wicked and despicable, right? They were the ones that set up the city of Sodom. This is, when the Israelites looked at them, they saw what was evil and despicable to God. They saw those that had suppressed them and beat them up. They hated them. In fact, when Ruth and Naomi go back, they start working in the fields of a landowner by the name of Boaz, a fantastic, fantastic man. And again, what we see is it is the hand of God. It is no accident that they end up in the fields of Boaz, because God's hand he is still at work in their lives. But here's what you have to know. Boaz must give a standing order to all of his men. No one is to touch, harm, assault, or rape Ruth. Now, why would he have to make that order? Because she was a Moabitess, and she would have been fair game. And here's, friends, she is in Moab, and she says to Naomi, wherever you go, I will go. And if I die, I die. Ruth understood to follow Naomi back to Judah to help take care of her mother-in-law could very well cost her her life. But she does it. Do you know anybody who said, I'll lay my life down for you? Yeah, Jesus Christ. What a great gift we have in Christ. And you see what the author is doing here? He's setting this up and he's saying, at her lowest moment, in her moment of greatest pain, God was still at work. He is always at work, secretly at work. Naomi gets this beautiful gift of grace. And friends, sometimes in our greatest pain, sometimes in the moment when we are suffering from the greatest loss, is when God gives us some very, very good gifts. Sometimes it is in that great pain that God is at work in very special ways that his grace comes to us, sometimes as a kind of death. Sometimes it is a death to insecurities that plagued us. Sometimes it is a death to jealousy or selfishness. Sometimes in our pain, we're willing to give up the things that we hold on to in this world. And when we give up on those things, it comes as a kind of a gift of grace, because now we can live free to be more of who God created us to be, free to live in faith and trust with God. Sometimes when everything's going well, we can be materialistic, we can be selfish, we can hang on to things, we can forget how much we depend on God. And sometimes in great pain, we turn to God, and some of the greatest gifts he can give us is to free us of some of those things that we could never otherwise be freed from. Sometimes we receive the gift of grace in ways that make us more whole people than we could have ever received all by ourselves. Doesn't make it any easier. But maybe you're here today and you've been dying, and it wasn't because of anything you did. But you know what? Maybe, just maybe, God is giving you gifts of grace. Maybe he's bringing someone into your life that's going to love you as never before. Maybe you'll discover you're not as dependent on other people as much as you thought you were. I don't know what it'll be, but this is a time, if you're in great pain, to look for those gifts. Now, sometimes finding those gifts can be very, very difficult in moments of pain, which is the third lesson that we see here in this story, and it's this: some blessings can only be seen in the rear view mirror. Sometimes we're in that moment of great pain, and it seems awful, and we're just like, there's nothing good that could come from this. I can't see how God is still working in my life right now. But you know what happens? Think of the times you've had a moment of great loss, great pain, great struggle, and maybe a year or years later, you look back on that part of your life and you say, oh my goodness, God was there. I can look back now in the kind of the rear view mirror of life, and I see how God was operating in ways I just couldn't see then. In fact, while I'd never pick the pain again, I would never give up what God did in my life in those moments, because it's made me more of the person God created. I grew spiritually in those moments. You see this again in this story, and the author is using what I think in Hebrew is a little bit of humor to get to this point. Look with me at verse 21, chapter 1, verse 21. And this is Naomi. She's now come back. She's arriving into Bethlehem. She's there in tow with Ruth. So here's Ruth and Naomi. They arrive in Bethlehem. And here's what happens. Verse 21, and this is Naomi speaking. Sweet Naomi. She says, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? She said, why? I'm empty. Look at me. I've got nothing. I'm empty. And your arms around Ruth. Nothing. I have no one. I've lost everything. Hi, Ruth. It's sweet to see you. I have nothing. And there's kind of this humor where Naomi is just, with great drama, laying this thing, I've got nothing. While her arm is around maybe the greatest gift of grace God has ever given her. It's kind of like Ruth standing there going, what do you mean you've got nothing? What am I, chopped liver? At this moment, there she is. But in kind of this strange, humorous moment where she's saying she's got nothing, and yet she's got everything right there with her that's come from Moab, following her back. But you know what, friends? I get it, right? You've got to get it. Think of those moments where you've been in great pain and you just couldn't see God's gift in that moment. Doesn't mean it's not there, but sometimes it is hard to see. Sometimes it is hard to see what God is fashioning in our lives, making us give up things that keep us from being all we were created to be. Sometimes He is forging new steel in us that we will use in coming years. He's making us into leaders. He's making us strong. He's making us more faithful, doing amazing things in our life. It's just we can't always see it in the moment. Sometimes we have to look back in order to see it. My daughter, one of her favorite movies is a little movie called 8 Below. Have y'all seen this movie? It's called 8 Below. It's about these dogs down in Antarctica, and the leader of their pack is this explorer by a guy by the name of Shepard. He goes down there and he helps people out, does all this stuff. Well, one day there is a geologist or somebody, a scientist of some sort, has got to run some tests down in Antarctica, goes down and hires this guy with his dogs to take him out where he can do this little test. Gets out there and everything goes bad. Some ice breaks. He falls and he breaks his arm or leg or something. He's in serious shape, so they've got to air vac him out of Antarctica. So Shepard has to leave his dogs. There's this moment where he's got to leave his dogs there. And what you have to know is my daughter loves dogs. She is a dog lover, okay? We get to the scene in the movie and the guy's, he's on the brink of death. They're trying to load him up in a helicopter to get the guy out of there. And my daughter's always like, oh, look at the dogs. Are the dogs going to be okay? And I'm like, the guy, he's being air vac'd out, honey. Oh, who cares about the guy? The dogs. Are the dogs okay? Well, they leave the dogs all by themselves, thinking that they will come back in a few days to rescue the dogs and get the dogs off of Antarctica before winter sets in. But the terrible twist in the story is that the storm moves in, ravages everything, and there is no way to get back to the dogs. The dogs are chained up outside in Antarctica for the winter. Bad scenario for the dogs, okay? Well, my daughter loves this movie, and the first time I watched it with her, I was a little worried that she was going to start freaking out at this point. But since she had already watched the movie 50 jillion times, she wasn't worried, because what she knows is what appears to be this terrible truth down in Antarctica is really going to be okay, because what she knows is that Shepard is still at work, always at work, secretly at work to rescue those dogs. He has not forgotten about those dogs. Every waking minute he spends trying to figure out how to get down there and to get to those dogs. And the dogs, they break loose and they have to feed themselves, and they go on this grand adventure, always in peril. And my daughter loves this story because she knows that behind the scenes, Shepard is working to rescue those dogs. And what the author knows is that while we may not see what God is doing in this moment right now, someday we will look back in the rearview mirror and we will see the good things that God is doing in our lives, even in our moments of greatest pain. Because Shepard rescues those dogs, and God rescues Naomi. It becomes this beautiful story as Ruth goes over there, the Moabitess who you would think would be killed or abused or destitute. She ends up catching the eye of Boaz, the rich rancher and farmer. They get married. They have this child, and there becomes this great scene at the end as this kind of love affair unfolds in the story, where all of a sudden Naomi, who's lost all, has this moment at the end of the story. In fact, look with me, flip over to chapter 4. Chapter 4, look at verse 14. And this is the rear view mirror picture here. There are these women around Naomi, and there's this fantastic scene. This is sweet Naomi who lost all. And here's what's said, verse 14. The women said, Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. And kind of two thoughts with that. This kinsman redeemer is both this person that would take care of you in your old age. You're not going to be destitute in your old age, but it is also this picture of Christ to come. It says, who he has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. And will Ruth's son become famous throughout Israel? Yes, he will. We'll see that in a moment. But look at this. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better, and a little bit more humor here in the story of Ruth. I love this. Your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. Better than 7 sons. 7 was kind of this perfect number, and to have 7 sons meant that in your old age you would be wealthy and well taken care of, lavished on. You'd have 7 different homes you could live in. And what the text is saying is Ruth is, she is so amazing. She's better than what's perfect. She's better than 7 sons. She is like a Xena, the princess warrior, okay? That's what it's saying here. So and then it goes on, and here's this tender scene, verse 16. Then Naomi took the child, and you got to picture this. Sweet Naomi who lost everything. Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. Naomi now gets to be a grandmother. Gets to be a grandmother for this child. And she's going to be taken care of. In the end, she was able to look back and say, God, you were there. You were there. And I want to encourage all of you who are here today. If you feel a little bit like Naomi, I promise you, you have reason to hope in the God that you follow. And that someday you will look back in the rearview mirror and you will see this, that God is still at work, always at work, and secretly at work in your life, friends. I want us to end this morning here by taking the Lord's Supper. And so I'm going to ask the ushers who are prepared to do the Lord's Supper, if you want to go back to your stations, the worship team's going to come out. And while they're doing that, I want to wrap this up here. There's this beautiful picture, right? Ruth becomes this kind of icon pointing to Christ, that God uses her to save Naomi in this beautiful way. And the son that she has, this is really interesting. The son she has, as the story plays out here, is fascinating. Look back at chapter 4. Look at verse 21. Because what we're going to get here is a genealogy. Why in the world would the story of Ruth end with a genealogy? Well, there's an important reason why. Look at this. Verse 21, and this is halfway through the genealogy. Solomon, the father of Boaz, right? That's the man that Ruth married. So Ruth married Boaz. Boaz, the father of Obed. Obed is the little baby that Naomi was holding in her lap. That's Ruth's son. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, who is Jesse the father of? King David, the greatest king to ever serve Israel. What line or lineage did Jesus Christ come from? David. Is that not remarkable? God was always at work. God led sweet Naomi through trial and tribulation. But she grew, and God blessed her with this little relationship with a little Moabite girl who seemed powerless. But that little Moabite girl became a gift from God, God's grace, that became like the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus Christ. God was at work, and he was at work in our lives. And now as followers of Christ, we come to see that work as it's played out with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So I'm going to ask if the ushers would come and begin to pass the bread.